There are moments in life when everything quietly falls apart, not with noise or drama, but with a slow, aching silence that settles into the chest. Plans stop making sense. Effort feels heavy, and the things we once held tightly begin to hurt us. This is not a story about giving up. It's a story about understanding when holding on is the very thing keeping us stuck. About how healing doesn't arrive through force, but through release. In a small riverside town where mornings smelled of fog and old wood, lived a man named Elias Mercer. He believed strength meant endurance, that love meant loyalty to the past, and that letting go was a kind of failure. This story will show you how his journey changed, and why peace often waits on the other side of release. Elias Mercer had spent most of his life believing that strength was measured by how long you could endure the same weight. Every morning before the sun rose, he walked down to the river, not because he loved it, but because it was familiar. The dock creaked the same way it always had. The water smelled the same. The air carried that damp stillness that made the world feel paused, as if nothing new could enter without permission. Elias was a riverboatman, like his father before him. He guided slow vessels across quiet waters, memorizing currents, respecting tides, trusting repetition. The river rewarded discipline, it punished carelessness, and Elias believed life worked the same way. If you stayed loyal long enough, things would remain. He lived alone in a modest house near the bend of the river. Inside, nothing had changed for years. A coat still hung behind the door, untouched. A cracked mug sat on the counter, never replaced. Photographs lined the shelf, smiles frozen in time, moments carefully preserved as proof that something beautiful once existed. To Elias, these were not memories. They were anchors. He told himself that holding on was honorable, that remembering meant respect, that letting go was a weakness people used to escape pain instead of facing it. And yet, every night when the river went quiet and the town lights dimmed, something heavy pressed against his chest. A tiredness that sleep never fixed. A restlessness that discipline could not cure. He had learned to function around the ache, not heal it, just live beside it. The townspeople admired him. They called him steady, reliable, strong. They saw a man who never complained, who showed up every day, who kept his boat clean and his word intact. What they didn't see was the way Elias avoided certain streets, the way his hand lingered on objects that no longer belonged to the present, the way his eyes searched the river as if expecting it to return something it had already taken. Deep down, Elias believed that if he held on tightly enough, the past might soften, that if he stayed loyal to what was lost, it would somehow honor him in return. But the truth was quieter. Holding on had become his identity, and without realizing it, he had stopped moving forward, not because he was incapable, but because he was afraid of what moving forward would require him to release. The river flowed endlessly beside him, always changing, never asking permission, and Elias, standing still on its banks, mistook resistance for strength, unaware that the lesson he needed most had been passing him every day. There is a quiet comfort in routine, especially when the rest of life feels uncertain. For Elias Mercer, routine was not just habit, it was refuge. Each morning followed the same careful rhythm. He rose before dawn, washed his face with cold water, and stepped outside while the world still slept. The river greeted him with a muted shimmer, fog curling gently above the surface, like a secret the water wasn't ready to share. Elias moved with precision. He checked the ropes, tightened knots, ran his hand along the side of the boat as if reassuring himself that it was still there. His discipline was flawless. Nothing was rushed, nothing was careless, and in those small, repeated acts he found something close to peace. The river responded to him. Passengers trusted him. Cargo arrived safely. There were no surprises, no sudden turns. On the surface, his life looked steady, almost successful. People nodded in quiet respect when he passed. Some even said they wished they had his kind of control. Elias believed them. He told himself that these small victories mattered, that showing up every day counted as progress, that as long as he kept moving, even in circles, he wasn't truly stuck. But stillness can be deceptive. Between crossings, Elias often sat alone on the edge of the dock, watching the water move past him. Leaves floated by, some spinning briefly before continuing downstream. He noticed how easily the river carried them, how little effort it took for them to move forward. And yet, he never followed. Instead, his mind wandered backward, to moments when life felt fuller, to conversations that ended too soon, to choices he replayed as if repetition could change their outcome. Success to Elias meant preservation, keeping things the way they were, proving that nothing had been lost. Not really. He didn't see how his discipline had slowly turned into control, how his strength had become rigidity, how the same habits that once built his life were now quietly limiting it. At night, when the town settled into silence, Elias would sit by the window, listening to the river's distant movement. It sounded like whispering, constant, patient, unbothered by time. He felt proud of his endurance, unaware that endurance without release eventually becomes exhaustion. The river kept flowing forward, and Elias, satisfied with still waters and small victories, mistook stability for growth, never questioning what it might cost him to stay exactly where he was. Loss rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with warning or permission. Sometimes it comes on a day that looks exactly like every other. The morning it happened, Elias Mercer followed his routine without deviation. The sky was pale, the air cool. The river looked calm, almost kind. He had guided his boat across these waters hundreds of times, trusted them with his livelihood, his identity, his sense of order. That trust would not be returned. Midway through the crossing, the current shifted. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough. A subtle pull beneath the surface, unseen, underestimated. Elias adjusted his course, confident in his experience, certain he could correct it the way he always had. But the river no longer responded the way it used to. The boat lurched. A rope snapped. Balance gave way to chaos. In the space of a few heartbeats, everything Elias depended on slipped beyond his control. The vessel struck hard against a hidden debris, the sound echoing like a crack through his chest. Water rushed in faster than he could fight it. His hands moved on instinct, but instinct was no match for momentum. The river took what it wanted. By the time help arrived, the damage was done. The boat, his boat, was ruined. Years of work, discipline, and identity lay broken against the shore, splintered and soaked. The river flowed on, indifferent to the wreckage it left behind. Elias stood there in silence, staring at what remained. His clothes were wet, his hands shaking, not from cold but from disbelief. He waited for anger to rise, for grief to scream, for something loud enough to match the loss. But what came instead was emptiness. The town gathered around him with concern in their eyes and words he barely heard. They spoke of accidents, of bad luck, of repairs and insurance, and moving on. Moving on. The phrase felt foreign, almost offensive. That night, Elias returned home alone. The house felt smaller, heavier. Without the boat waiting for him at dawn, the future stretched out unfamiliar and exposed. His discipline had no place to land. His routine had no anchor. For the first time in years, he sat in the dark without distraction. Memories flooded in, not gently, but all at once. Every moment he had tried to preserve now felt fragile, threatened. The past, which he had clung to for stability, suddenly felt like a burden he could no longer carry. He told himself the loss was temporary, that he would rebuild, that things would return to how they were if he worked hard enough. But deep down, a quieter truth surfaced. The river had taken more than wood and metal. It had taken certainty, and it had exposed a fear Elias had spent years avoiding, the fear that holding on couldn't protect him from change. Outside, the river continued its endless journey. Inside, something in Elias finally broke, and with that break came the beginning of a question he wasn't ready to answer. What happens when the thing you build your life around no longer exists? Grief does not always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like refusal. In the days after the accident, Elias Mercer moved through the town like a shadow of himself. He nodded when spoken to. He answered when required. But his mind stayed fixed on the moment before everything changed, replaying it again and again, as if repetition might reverse the outcome. He returned to the river each morning, even though there was no boat to guide. He stood at the dock, hands at his pockets, staring at the water with quiet defiance. The river had taken something from him, and Elias was not ready to forgive it. He told himself he just needed time, that once the shock faded, he would rebuild, that his discipline, his endurance, would once again prove stronger than circumstance. But rebuilding required acceptance, and acceptance felt too much like surrender. Inside his home, the past tightened its grip. Elias touched the old coat more often now. He lingered over photographs, tracing faces with his eyes, measuring what was lost against what remained. Every object became a reminder, not of love, but of absence. He began to believe that letting go would erase meaning, that releasing the past would dishonor everything it gave him. So he held on harder. He avoided conversations about the future. He dismissed offers of help. When people suggested new work or different paths, he smiled politely and changed the subject. They didn't understand, he told himself. This wasn't something you replaced. At night, guilt crept in like a tide. Elias questioned every choice he had made, every adjustment, every second of confidence. He blamed himself for trusting the river, for believing experience could outmatch change. Sleep became restless. Silence grew loud. The discipline that once gave him strength now trapped him in patterns of thought that went nowhere. He woke each morning with the same heaviness, the same resistance to a world that kept moving forward without asking if he was ready. Anchored to yesterday, Elias mistook loyalty for love. He believed that pain was proof of devotion, that if it still hurt, it still mattered. But clinging to the past did not preserve it. It only prevented him from meeting the present. The river, patient and unmoved, continued its journey. Elias remained on the shore, gripping memories like lifelines, unaware that the longer he held on, the deeper the ache would settle. He had not yet reached the bottom, but he was sinking. There was a place beneath grief where words stop forming, where effort feels pointless, where even memory grows tired of repeating itself. Elias Mercer reached that place quietly. Days began to blur together. Without the structure of work, time lost its shape. Morning light slipped through the window, untouched by purpose. Meals went uneaten, conversations unanswered. The world did not collapse around him, it simply moved on. And that, somehow, hurt more. He stopped going to the dock, stopped watching the river. What once felt like loyalty now felt like humiliation. The water had proven something he didn't want to accept, that control was always an illusion. So he withdrew. The house grew still in a way that felt unnatural. Dust settled on surfaces that once held routine. The photographs on the shelf no longer brought comfort. They felt distant, like echoes from a life he could no longer access. Elias sat alone most evenings, listening to the ticking of an old clock. Each second sounded heavier than the last, as if time itself was reminding him of his stillness. For the first time, he questioned his strength. Had discipline truly made him resilient, or had it simply distracted him from vulnerability? Had holding on honored the past, or imprisoned him inside it? There were moments when he felt nothing at all. No sadness, no anger, just a hollow space where meaning used to live. And that emptiness frightened him more than pain ever had. Because pain meant connection. Emptiness meant absence. One night, Elias stood by the window and watched the moon reflect faintly off the distant river. He realized how long it had been since he felt part of anything larger than his own thoughts. The river no longer whispered to him. It no longer waited. He felt small, not weak, but reduced, stripped of the roles and routines that once defined him. And in that stripping away, a question surfaced, gentle, unavoidable. If I am no longer who I was, who am I allowed to become? That question did not bring relief. It brought silence. But silence, though uncomfortable, is often the last place we arrive before change becomes possible. Elias did not know it yet, but he had reached the moment where holding on no longer protected him, where resistance no longer worked. He had reached the lowest point, not because he had failed, but because he had finally stopped pretending he hadn't. And somewhere beyond that stillness, something was waiting. Change rarely arrives the way we imagine it will. Not as a breakthrough, not as a moment of clarity wrapped in light. Sometimes it arrives as a simple interruption. One afternoon, after days of avoiding the river, Elias Mercer found himself walking toward it without deciding to. His feet moved before his thoughts could object. The air was warm, the sky unremarkable. Nothing about the day suggested meaning. The river was calm when he reached it, not forgiving, not hostile, just present. He sat on a worn bench near the water, staring at the slow movement he had once known so well. For the first time in weeks, he didn't look for answers. He didn't replay the past. He simply watched. That's when he noticed the old man. He was sitting a short distance away, feeding small pieces of bread to the birds. His movements were unhurried, almost careless. He hummed softly, an uneven tune that rose and fell with no clear direction. They sat in silence for a long while, two strangers sharing the same view. Eventually, the old man spoke. "Funny thing about rivers," he said, not turning his head. They never keep what they touch. Elias felt the words settle before he understood them. They carry things, the man continued gently. Branches, boats, sometimes whole lives. But they don't hold on. If they did, they'd stop being rivers. Elias swallowed. He didn't respond. The old man glanced at him then, his eyes kind but observant. You look like someone who's been standing still for a long time. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I thought staying meant being strong, Elias finally said. The words surprised him as they left his mouth. I thought holding on was the right thing to do. The old man nodded slowly. Sometimes it is. For a while. He tossed another piece of bread into the water. The birds gathered, then drifted apart again. But strength changes, the man added. What protects you in one season can suffocate you in another. Elias felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, not pain, recognition. I don't know how to let go, he admitted. If I release what I had, I'm afraid there'll be nothing left. The old man smiled, soft and knowing. Letting go doesn't empty you, he said. It makes room. They sat quietly after that. No advice, no solutions, just the sound of water moving forward without effort. When Elias finally turned to speak again, the old man was gone. No farewell, no explanation. Only the river remained. And for the first time since the loss, Elias didn't feel abandoned by its movement. He felt invited to consider a truth he had resisted for far too long, that healing was not about forgetting, that letting go was not failure, that sometimes the most courageous act is allowing life to carry you forward without demanding it return what it never promised to keep. Letting go is rarely a single decision. It is a practice. After that afternoon by the river, Elias Mercer did not wake up transformed. His grief did not vanish. His memories did not soften overnight. But something subtle had shifted, like a knot loosening just enough to breathe. He returned to the river the next day, not to work, not to prove anything, just to sit. He began with small acts. He cleaned the house, not to erase the past, but to make space for the present. He placed the old coat into a box instead of leaving it behind the door. He didn't throw it away. He simply set it down. That mattered. Discipline returned, but in a different form. No longer rigid, no longer punishing. It became gentle structure, a way of caring for himself rather than controlling the world. Each morning, Elias walked. Each evening, he wrote a few lines in a notebook, not about what he'd lost, but about what he noticed. The way light moved across the water, the sound of birds lifting together, the quiet relief of a day that did not demand answers. He learned that acceptance did not mean agreement. It meant acknowledgement. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when grief returned without warning, when the urge to reach backward felt overwhelming. In those moments, Elias reminded himself of what the old man had said. What protects you in one season can suffocate you in another. So he practiced release in small ways. He allowed memories to pass without chasing them. He let conversations end without explaining himself. He stopped measuring his worth by what he could preserve. Healing felt slow, unimpressive, almost invisible, but it was happening. The river began to feel different, not as something he had to conquer or mistrust, but as something he could learn from again. Its movement no longer mocked his stillness. It mirrored possibility. Elias realized that discipline was not about holding on. It was about showing up, even when letting go felt uncomfortable. And in that showing up, he felt something new take shape. Not certainty, not control, but peace. The kind that doesn't demand permanence, the kind that allows change. Growth is never a straight line. Just when you think you've moved beyond something, it finds a way to test you again. For Elias Mercer, the test came quietly, wrapped in familiarity. One morning, as he walked along the riverbank, he saw a boat tied at the dock. Not his. Newer, stronger. Its owner was nearby, struggling with the stubborn rope, frustration written across his face. Instinct took over before thought. Elias stepped forward and offered help. His hands remembered what to do. The knots, the tension, the balance between force and patience. For a moment it felt like coming home. The man thanked him, then asked the question Elias had half expected and half dreaded. "Ever think about getting back on the water?" The words stirred something dangerous. Comfort. Longing. The illusion that returning meant restoring what was lost. That night Elias lay awake, imagining himself back in command, back in control. The old identity whispered promises of purpose and pride. It told him that letting go didn't have to be permanent, that maybe the lesson was over. But deep down, he knew the truth. Returning for the wrong reasons would not be healing, it would be avoidance. The old currents were tempting because they were familiar, because they asked nothing new of him, because they allowed him to believe he was unchanged. The next day, Elias returned to the dock. He looked at the water, not with resentment, not with nostalgia, but with honesty. He realized that strength was no longer about proving he could survive the same life again. It was about choosing growth over comfort. So he stepped back, not away from the river, but away from the need to reclaim the past. Consistency, he learned, was not repeating old patterns. It was choosing alignment even when emotion pulled elsewhere. The urge faded slowly, not defeated, but understood. And in resisting the familiar pull, Elias felt something solidify within him. Not identity, not role, character. Peace does not arrive as excitement. It arrives as alignment. For Elias Mercer, that alignment unfolded quietly over time. He no longer woke with resistance in his chest. The days felt lighter, not because they were easier, but because he was no longer fighting them. He found purpose in ways he hadn't anticipated. He helped along the docks when asked, not as a riverboatman reclaiming his title, but as a man offering experience without attachment. He taught children how to read the water, how to respect its movement without trying to master it. In doing so, he realized something profound. Purpose is not a role, it is a way of being. The river no longer represented loss, it represented continuity. Life moving forward, taking, giving, reshaping, without apology. Elias felt whole again, not because he had regained what was lost, but because he had released the need to. He stood by the water one evening, watching the sky change color, and felt gratitude, not for the past, but for the journey that led him here. Rebirth, he understood, was not dramatic. It was gentle, it was earned through patience. And in that gentleness he found peace. If you listen closely, every life leaves behind a lesson. Elias Mercer never stood on a stage to share his story. He didn't write it down as advice or offer it as a solution. He simply lived it. And in doing so, the river taught him truths that do not belong to one man, but to all of us. So now, this part of the journey turns gently toward you. There will be moments in your life when holding on feels like strength. And sometimes it is. But there will also be seasons when holding on is the very thing that keeps you from healing. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It does not erase love, effort, or meaning. It honors them by allowing them to rest. You are not weak for releasing what no longer fits the life you are growing into. You are not failing when something ends. Failure is not loss. It is refusing to grow after loss. Discipline is not control. True discipline is the courage to show up honestly, to sit with discomfort, to choose peace over pride, to release identities that no longer serve your purpose. Healing is quiet work. It happens in small choices, in setting things down without throwing them away, in allowing yourself to change without demanding permission from the past. You don't need to rush your rebirth. Rivers don't rush. They move forward because they trust that forward is enough. And if you are standing still right now, if life has taken something you are not ready to lose, know this: you are not broken. You are between versions. Strength will return. Purpose will reshape itself. Peace will arrive. Not when everything makes sense, but when you stop fighting what is. Like Elias, you will learn that letting go is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a truer one. So take a breath, release what is heavy, and allow life to carry you forward. If this story brought you reflection, comfort, or quiet motivation, consider supporting it by liking, sharing, or subscribing, so these stories can continue reaching those who need them. The river keeps flowing, and so can you.